Hey guys, tonight we're slipping behind the heavy stone walls of ancient cities, walking the ramparts as the sun bakes the stone beneath your feet. You can hear the clang of blacksmiths below, smell the stew bubbling in open pots, and feel the pulse of a civilization convinced these walls will hold forever. But here's the thing, they almost never do. No matter how thick, how tall, or how cleverly designed, every wall eventually meets someone stubborn enough, clever enough, or just plain angry enough to bring it down. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know, where are you listening from and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the dust of an ancient city under siege, feeling the desperate energy of people stacking stones, digging moats, and racing to raise walls before the enemy arrives. You can almost hear their hurried shouts, their frantic chiseling, their hopeful prayers to gods who may or may not be paying attention. The first walls were simple, wooden palisades or stacked mud bricks. They gave people just enough security to feel like they'd built something permanent. But permanence is a tricky thing. The second you build a wall, you're basically daring the world to try and knock it down. Soon, walls evolved. Stone replaced wood. Double layers replaced singles. Towers sprouted at regular intervals, allowing defenders to shoot in every direction. And those walls became the pride of cities. To live inside the walls was to be part of something protected, something civilized. Outside was wilderness, chaos, bandits, roaming armies. Inside was life. But as you stroll along the parapet, admiring the thick stonework, here's the uncomfortable truth nibbling at the back of your mind. Walls are not shields. They are invitations, an open challenge. Build it tall enough, thick enough, and all you've really done is dare someone to spend years figuring out how to crush it. Historians still argue whether the earliest proper siege tactics came from the Assyrians, or if smaller tribal conflicts before them had already invented rudimentary siege tools. What we do know, by the time the Assyrians were rolling across Mesopotamia around 900 BCE, they weren't just attacking, they were methodically dismantling cities. Imagine it. You're standing on a wooden tower above the gate, clutching a crude spear, when the ground starts to vibrate. A rumbling wave moves closer and closer until you see them. Rows of Assyrian soldiers dragging siege ladders, pulling battering rams, and shielding themselves with massive leather-wrapped pavises, portable walls. They came prepared, and that's the genius of siege warfare. It wasn't just about brute force. It was slow, deliberate problem solving. It's like trying to break into the world's angriest, most paranoid neighbor's house, and you've brought a moving truck filled with tools to do it. Walls went up, but siege weapons followed. It became an arms race, a centuries-long back-and-forth game where every new defensive feature was met with an offensive counter. Build higher walls? Fine. Build taller ladders. Build sloped foundations? Okay. Use longer rams with heavier heads. Build moats? No problem. Fill them with dirt, rocks, or bodies. The funny thing is, you probably think of sieges as grand, high-stakes events where kings duel with generals. But most of the time, siege warfare was, well, boring. Weeks of waiting, months of building machines, years of wearing down the defenders. You'd get up each morning, eat your stale bread, maybe hurl a rock or two, Then wait. And wait. Unless, of course, you were one of the poor souls who had to live inside a besieged city. That's where things got desperate. Food ran out. Rats became dinner. Water got contaminated. Disease spread faster than rumors. And all the while, those enormous machines were grinding closer, battering the gates, shaking the walls, taunting you with every thunderous blow. And here's a quirky little nugget. Some ancient cities deliberately built tiny postern gates at ground level, just big enough for one person to crawl through. Not for escape. Nope. These were emergency doors for counterattacks. Quick sorties where defenders would dash out, burn a siege engine, and scramble back inside before the enemy could react. Like medieval fire drills, except with swords. The thing is, these postern gates were a gamble. If you mistimed your attack, if you left it open for too long, the enemy could flood in behind you. Suddenly, your secret door wasn't so secret anymore. Some historians still argue whether these sorties were truly decisive or mostly symbolic, a last defiant punch before surrender. And even when walls held, they didn't guarantee survival. Sometimes they became traps. During long sieges, cities turned in on themselves. Factions fought over dwindling resources. Citizens begged to open the gates. Others screamed to hold fast. It wasn't just a battle outside the walls. It was a slow, grinding civil war inside them. But those early walls, they mattered. They bought time. They forced the attackers to stop, to think, to build. They gave cities a chance. And for a while, that was enough. As you walk along the crumbling edge of these ancient defenses, you realize that every stone tells a story. Not of a city that survived, but of one that dared to believe it could. The air cools as night falls, the noise of construction fading into the soft shuffle of patrols. The torches flicker, the shadows stretch, and you pause, resting your hand on the rough surface of the wall. It's thick, it's tall, but you can't shake the feeling that something is coming. Something big, something loud. And you're right, because just beyond the horizon, the battering rams are already being carved. You wake to the sound of hammers and the groaning protest of wood under stress. The enemy isn't wasting time. They've begun their noisy craft just outside the city walls, assembling something you can already guess from the rhythm of their work. A battering ram. You peer over the edge of the battlement, squinting through morning mist and smoke. And there it is, the skeleton of a siege engine taking shape. The frame is raw now, like ribs without flesh. But soon enough, it will grow its wooden armor, gain its iron-capped head, and start its brutal purpose. Battering rams are nothing fancy, and that's what makes them terrifying. There's no delicate engineering here, no intricate pulleys or clever misdirections. It's a giant log, sharpened and wrapped in iron, designed to do one thing: slam, 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 until gates burst like brittle bones. The simplicity is part of its beauty and its horror. The Assyrians didn't just invent these, they industrialized them. Picture shielded rams, their wooden roofs slathered in wet animal hides to resist fire, slowly trundling towards city gates. Inside, soldiers heave the log back and forth, each swing a heartbeat closer to collapse. You might imagine them sweating in a rolling wooden tunnel, the stench of pitch and wet leather thick in the air, the noise deafening, their world narrowed to one task: swing and strike, swing and strike. Quirky side note, some rams actually had built-in water storage, like ancient fire extinguishers. Barrels sloshed inside, ready to douse flames if defenders tossed burning pitch or set the engine ablaze. A mobile battering ram with a medieval sprinkler system? Kind of brilliant, honestly. Historians still argue whether these covered rams ever gave attackers a serious edge, or if defenders adapted quickly with their own counter tricks, rolling burning wheels downhill, digging trenches, or aiming every available missile at the operators. Either way, when that hollow, rhythmic thump begins, it carries through the stone, through the streets, and right into your chest. The sound isn't just physical, it's psychological. You can hear your own walls crumbling long before they actually do. You move along the battlement now, watching defenders scramble to improvise. Boiling liquids, usually water, not oil because oil was far too expensive, are poured from murder holes onto the operators below. Sometimes it's hot sand instead, and honestly, hot sand is worse. It sifts through armor, burrows into the tiniest gaps, especially around the neck and wrists, and burns like a tiny, relentless army. You think you can handle it until it's in your gloves, under your helmet, cooking you alive. You glance down as men heave heavy stones over the walls, aiming to smash the ram or crush the soldiers beneath it. Arrows streak the sky, but the smoked roof of the ram, slick with wet hides, shrugs them off like raindrops. Every defense has a counter, and sometimes the only option left is desperation. That's when defenders try to hook the ram itself. Yes, with actual iron hooks attached to chains, they lower them down to snag the engine and yank it off course. And if that doesn't work, they open sally ports, small hidden gates, and rush out in wild sorties, torches in hand, trying to set the ram ablaze in a mad dash of hope. But let's say none of that works. Let's say the ram gets close, protected, steady, unstoppable. The pounding starts, an earth-shaking pulse that rattles bones and knocks dust from ceilings. With each slam, the fibers of the gate groan and split. You've seen gates reinforced with iron bands, layered with thick oak beams, but everything has a breaking point. The hinges scream, and suddenly the gate gives. When that breach cracks open, panic explodes like a long-held breath. Attackers surge forward, desperate to funnel through the narrow gap, while defenders scramble to plug it with wagons, rubble, furniture, anything they can shove into the maw of the breach. The first moments are the bloodiest. If the attackers can't break through quickly, they get trapped in a bottleneck, crushed by falling stones, peppered by arrows from above, sliced by swords from every side. And don't be fooled. Sometimes the gate is a trap on purpose. Some cities designed double or triple gates, creating a death passage where invaders would be boxed in, surrounded by murder holes and archers. You think you've broken through? Surprise. It's a hallway of doom. They even gave it a charming name, the Killing Passage. There's a fringe theory that some defenders deliberately made their gates appear weaker than they actually were, luring attackers into these lethal traps. Historians still debate whether that was tactical genius or just opportunistic defenders making the best of a rough situation. Either way, you don't want to be the first guy through that gate. If the attackers succeed, though, the city transforms instantly. What was once an orderly fortress becomes a brutal, chaotic maze. Streets turn into alleys of death, homes into barricades, doorways into desperate choke points. There's no more distance. It's all breath on breath, sword on sword, and no clean lines. You're fighting in vegetable carts, over broken pottery, slipping in the dust and the blood. And remember, while soldiers clash at the breach, families inside the city tremble in the shadows. Civilians aren't just bystanders, they're part of the siege. They feel the starvation first. They watch the walls quake. They sometimes plead with their own commanders to surrender before the gates fall. Siege warfare isn't just about breaking walls. It's about breaking people. Here's a chilling strategy some commanders used. Delay the final blow on purpose. Starve the city. Let panic rot it from the inside. Let disease do what the ram cannot. In some cases, attackers had fully built rams and chose not to use them, waiting instead for the mine to collapse before the gate ever did. You wander past what's left of an ancient gate now, splintered and sagging, the iron hinges twisted like bones long out of joint. The silence is thick here, but in your mind, you can still hear it, that rhythmic echoing thump, a sound that even now seems to vibrate in the stones under your feet. You turn away from the battered gate, but the memory of that pounding ram still hums in your bones. Yet beyond the brute force of wood and iron, something even more unsettling rolls into view, the trebuchet. You hear it before you see it, the creak of winches tightening ropes, the low chant of engineers carefully winding the counterweight into position. There's a rhythm to it, but it's slower, deeper, like the drumbeat of a distant, inevitable storm. When the trebuchet finally lurches into action, it feels like the entire earth pauses to watch. The trebuchet isn't a quick weapon. It takes patience, time, and just the right kind of brain power. It's not for the soldier who wants to smash something right now. It's for the one who enjoys the slow, psychological crush. Imagine waiting half an hour between shots while your enemy nervously guesses what's coming next. That's not just warfare. That's art. One of the most legendary trebuchets of all time was Warwolf, built by the English during the siege of Stirling Castle in Scotland. This thing wasn't just big, it was colossal. So terrifying, in fact, that the defenders reportedly surrendered before Warwolf was even fired. But King Edward I refused to accept their surrender. He wanted to see his prized machine in action, so he made them wait. The defenders had to sit there, knowing the attack was coming anyway, knowing the Warwolf shot would still thunder toward their walls. Historians still argue whether that story is a little too perfect, but whether it's fully true or glorified, it perfectly captures what made the trebuchet special. It wasn't just about the damage, it was about the dread, the slow preparation, the looming silence, the growing knowledge that you couldn't stop it. You inch along the battlements now, watching as enemy engineers work with almost delicate focus. Trebuchets are complicated beasts. They require careful math. How much tension? How much counterweight? What's the ideal sling length? Too loose, and the shot fizzles. Too tight, and the whole arm might snap like a twig. The counterweight, sometimes weighing thousands of pounds, has to be cranked into position slowly by teams of men turning wheels the size of wagons. The whole process takes minutes, sometimes hours. But once ready, there's no mistaking the moment of release. The heavy arm swings forward. The sling whips around, and the projectile soars high and lazy, as if it's got all the time in the world to decide where to land. Sometimes, though, the projectile isn't what you expect. There's a peculiar account from the Middle Ages of attackers launching barrels full of bees over city walls. Yes, bees. Imagine a wooden barrel smashing open in the town square, unleashing a storm of angry insects. Did it work? Historians still debate whether that was clever biological warfare or just the world's most aggressive prank. But either way, you probably didn't want to be near ground zero when it happened. Not all shots were terrifying. Some were just petty. If you were feeling particularly theatrical, you might load a trebuchet with severed heads, sometimes those of captured messengers, sometimes former comrades. It was a clear message. We're coming for the rest of you. And yet, for all its showmanship, the trebuchet had serious limitations. It was big, it was slow, it needed skilled engineers and flat, stable ground. Mud could wreck the whole operation. And a misfire? Well, that could tear the machine apart, or, in some grimly funny cases, send the projectile flying backward into your own ranks. Still, the trebuchet's power was unmatched. It could hurl boulders weighing hundreds of pounds over distances of 300 yards or more. That's the length of 3 football fields. You could hit the inner courtyard without even breaching the outer gate. Imagine living inside the city and watching rooftops shatter, market stalls explode, and walls crack, without ever seeing your enemy's face. Some cities tried to fight back with counterweight trebuchets of their own, a medieval version of long-distance chess. Others attempted daring sorties to burn the enemy engines while they were being built. But stopping a trebuchet wasn't easy. You had to get to it before it fully assembled. Once it was ready, your options shrank fast, and sometimes the trebuchet wasn't there to kill you. It was there to haunt you. The rhythm of its preparation, the silence before the shot, the waiting, it all carved away at your courage. Some chroniclers note that the mere sound of a trebuchet winding up was enough to cause soldiers to abandon the walls. There's still an open debate among historians whether the psychological weight of siege engines did more to break cities than their physical blows. It's the same question we ask about modern warfare today. Does the bomb matter more, or does the fear of the bomb do most of the work? You pass by the husk of a trebuchet now. Its wooden beams weathered and splintered, iron fittings rusting quietly under centuries of sky. But even in ruin, you can picture it, towering, creaking, hungry for its next payload. The memory of its arc still lingers, like a phantom overhead. And as you continue along the empty walls, you start to realize something. The siege isn't just a battle of walls and weapons. It's a long, careful war of patience, noise, silence, and waiting. Lots and lots of waiting. You keep moving, following the path where the siege engines once loomed. But the war isn't just fought from a distance. Some siege weapons don't wait politely outside the walls. They roll right up to the front door, knock loudly, and dump soldiers directly onto your head. Enter the siege tower. You spot one now in the distance, rumbling forward like some bizarre wooden skyscraper on wheels. Siege towers don't sneak up on anyone. They're big, bold, and about as subtle as a brass band in a library. Imagine a boxy, multi-story building wrapped in wet animal hides to resist fire, bristling with archers on the upper decks, and stuffed with heavily armed soldiers, itching to pour out the moment the tower kisses the wall. You can't ignore it, and you certainly can't pretend it's not there. The logic behind siege towers is gloriously simple. Walls only work if you can't get over them. So why not build something taller than the wall? Problem solved. Well, almost. Historians still debate whether the earliest siege towers appeared in ancient Mesopotamia, or if they were inspired by even older structures lost to time. But the Assyrians were certainly among the first to use them in grand, terrifying fashion. Their versions looked like mobile balconies, complete with covered firing positions and wheeled bases. And from there, the arms race to build bigger and badder towers took off. By the time you reach the siege tower's wooden flank, you notice the details. It's not just a box, it's a fortress on wheels. The Greeks loved them, but the Hellenistic kingdoms? Oh, they turned siege towers into floating nightmares. Take the Helpolis, or Taker of Cities, built by Demetrius during the Siege of Rhodes in 305 BCE. Picture this, a 9-story behemoth, over 100 feet tall, covered in iron plates for extra protection, packed with catapults on nearly every level. It took thousands of soldiers just to push it. Unfortunately, it also partially collapsed under its own ridiculous weight. A little ambitious, maybe, but you have to admire the commitment. Even today, historians squabble over whether Demetrius's super tower would have actually succeeded if it hadn't broken down. Some say it was doomed from the start. Others claim it was a masterpiece of siege engineering that just needed a few more tweaks. Either way, it makes one thing crystal clear. Siege warfare wasn't about being careful. It was about big bets and bigger egos. As you circle the tower, you can almost feel its weight pressing into the earth. Siege towers weren't light or fast. Mud was their mortal enemy. The enemy's archers knew this and would fire flaming arrows or roll boulders to try to slow the approach. Sometimes, defenders would even dig massive trenches or flood the ground in front of the walls just to strand the tower in a swampy, miserable grave. But when a tower made it to the wall, oh, that's when the real panic set in. You see, siege ladders were one thing, quick, scattered, easy to push off. But a siege tower, that delivered entire squads of attackers right onto your battlements. It was like having a full-size door suddenly appear on your wall, opening straight into chaos. You glance up and see the gangplank lowering. From inside the tower, soldiers pour out like ants from a kicked nest, weapons raised. Archers raining arrows down from the upper decks to cover their advance. For defenders, this moment was terrifying. No longer a battle fought at a distance, but a hand-to-hand nightmare, where every step backward felt like the walls were closing in. Some commanders had clever tricks to slow siege towers. Roman defenders sometimes built smaller, secondary walls called counter-scarp defenses, a last-ditch barrier to trap attackers even if they made it past the main wall. Others lined the approaches with spikes, ditches, or even rolling logs to block the tower's wheels. The Byzantine defenders of Constantinople, famous for their stubbornness, even greased the roads leading to their walls to stall siege towers in their tracks. Imagine the frustration. Spending weeks building your beautiful 9-story wooden monster, only to watch it skid helplessly in the mud. But the scariest part? Once that gangplank dropped, there was no turning back. The tower didn't reverse. There was no retreat button. Soldiers pouring out onto the walls had one option: win or die right there. There's one fascinating account from the Siege of Jerusalem in 1099, during the First Crusade. The Crusaders constructed massive siege towers and pushed them toward the city walls, only to realize the walls were higher than they thought. Quick on their feet, they added extra stories mid-siege, a kind of emergency home renovation under enemy fire. Did it work? Barely. But the lesson stuck. Always measure twice before building a skyscraper on wheels. Historians still argue whether siege towers were the ultimate solution, or just one option in a crowded toolbox of siege weapons. Some castles were nearly impervious to them, especially those built on cliffs or surrounded by marshes. Others fell spectacularly when a siege tower managed to breach the line. You reach the top of the abandoned tower now, standing where archers once crouched, loosing arrows into the frantic defenders. From this height, the battlefield stretches out like a toy diorama. Catapults, rams, engineers scrambling, and soldiers waiting for the call to charge. You can almost hear the heartbeat of the siege, the rhythm of waiting, building, charging, failing, and trying again. And as you walk the creaking gangplank, you realize that siege warfare wasn't just about smashing walls. It was about solving puzzles. Every new defense inspired a new attack, and every new attack forced defenders to get even more creative. It was an arms race in slow motion. Not every siege tower made it. Many were burned. Some sank in mud. Others simply toppled over like stubborn toddlers who refused to nap. But when they worked, they changed the game. They didn't just climb the wall. They erased the idea that walls could keep you safe. You step back onto the battlement and look one more time at the looming tower behind you. It's empty now, just dry wood and rusted iron. But you can still feel the charge of that moment. The rattle of wheels, the snap of bowstrings, the collective breath held by both sides as the gangplank slammed down. Siege towers didn't knock, they barged in. You leave the hulking siege tower behind, stepping carefully over broken planks and twisted iron plates. But the battle didn't just rage above ground. Some of the most terrifying moments of a siege happened where you couldn't see them, underground, in tunnels where shadows swallowed soldiers whole. Welcome to the eerie, suffocating world of siege tunneling, also called sapping. You trudge toward the base of the wall, where a gaping hole marks the start of a collapsed tunnel. It's darker here, the air cooler, the ground looser beneath your boots. Siege tunneling was a dark art, not glamorous like trebuchets or grand like siege towers, but quietly devastating. The plan was brutally simple. Dig under the enemy's wall, prop the tunnel up with wooden beams, and when the moment was right, set those beams on fire. The tunnel would collapse, the earth would sink, and the wall above would crumble like a soggy biscuit. There were no trumpets for this kind of warfare. No grand charges or flying rocks. Just slow, claustrophobic digging. The kind where you couldn't even stand up straight. The Assyrians practiced it early on, but the Greeks and Persians refined it. And by medieval Europe, siege tunneling had become terrifyingly precise. Historians still debate whether the Spartans were the first to use countermining, or if earlier examples existed that simply didn't leave evidence. But one of the earliest recorded cases comes from the siege of Plataea in 429 BCE. The Spartans tunneled under the city's walls, planning their silent collapse, only for the defenders to hear them, literally. The Plataeans dug their own tunnels to intercept the invaders underground, turning the dirt into a brutal knife fight in the dark. Imagine swinging a blade in tunnels barely wider than your shoulders, with collapsing soil just inches from your face. No cavalry charges here, just the sound of picks, hurried breathing, and the occasional whisper of enemy boots getting closer. You crouch down and step into the mouth of the old tunnel. The walls press in immediately, and the wooden supports creak under the weight of earth they've held back for centuries. It's the kind of silence that hums in your ears, broken only by the scuff of your boots against the packed dirt. Siege tunneling was slow, dangerous, and frankly, a little bit insane. But when it worked, the effect was catastrophic. One of the most infamous examples happened in 1212, during the siege of Rochester Castle in England. King John's forces dug beneath the southern wall, stacked the tunnel with pig fat. Yes, pig fat, because it burned hot and long, and set it ablaze. The wooden supports collapsed, the tunnel caved in, and an entire section of the castle wall thundered to the ground. The defenders were so shocked, they surrendered soon after. Historians still argue whether the siege of Rochester was an engineering triumph or a desperate gamble. Some claim the soil conditions made the collapse inevitable. Others think the defenders simply weren't prepared for underground warfare. Either way, tunneling proved that you didn't have to go over or through a wall. You could just take the ground out from under it. You crawled deeper, brushing against the rough wooden beams, some blackened by centuries-old fires. Tunneling wasn't just about digging. It required patience, knowledge of the soil, and nerves of steel. Medieval siege engineers had to understand which types of earth would collapse quickly, how to angle their tunnels, and how to listen for signs of enemy countermining. They were part demolition experts, part geologists, part gamblers. And the stakes? Oh, just your city's survival. The defenders, of course, weren't just sitting around, waiting to be buried. They became masters of listening. Crews would press their ears to the ground or place bowls of water near the walls, watching for ripples caused by the vibrations of distant digging. The moment they heard the telltale scrape of enemy picks, they'd dig their own tunnels to intercept. When the two tunnels met, it wasn't quiet diplomacy. It was knives, axes, and pure panic in the choking dark. In some cases, defenders even flooded the tunnels, using nearby rivers or reservoirs to collapse the enemy's shafts. There's a curious tale from the Siege of Metz in the 16th century, where defenders reportedly diverted a river into the besiegers' tunnels, drowning sappers and turning the earth into soup. Did it happen exactly like that? Historians still debate the details, but whether by water, fire, or furious counterattacks, defenders fought back tooth and nail beneath their own cities. And you know what? Siege tunneling didn't vanish with the medieval era. The tactic kept creeping forward through history, resurfacing in the trenches of World War I, where massive mines were planted under enemy lines, waiting to detonate with horrifying power. One of the largest, the Lochnagar mine, exploded on July 1st, 1916, creating a crater that still scars the French countryside. Some things, it seems, never really go out of style. You shuffle a bit deeper into the tunnel, the air growing thicker, the beams now dripping with damp. In these spaces, there was no glory, no shining armor, just sweat, fear, and the constant terror of the ceiling giving way. Some sappers collapsed from exhaustion, some suffocated when the air grew too thin, and others perished in sudden, brutal cave-ins. And yet, this quiet warfare shaped the sieges of the ancient and medieval world just as much as the mighty trebuchets or rumbling siege towers. Siege tunneling was the unseen hand pulling the thread from the tapestry of a city's defenses. You step out of the collapsed tunnel and into the open sunlight again, brushing the dust from your sleeves. For all the terrifying patience of siege tunnels, sometimes the defenders didn't have the luxury of waiting in silence. Sometimes, their best answer to the looming machines and creeping engineers was, well, to fight fire with fire, literally. Welcome to the wild world of defensive siege weapons, where boiling liquids, burning pitch, and even ancient flamethrowers took center stage. You stroll along the inner wall of a battered fortress, tracing your fingers over the smooth stone where defenders once poured their deadliest secret, Greek fire. Now, if you're picturing some kind of medieval Molotov cocktail, you're close. But Greek fire was worse. Much worse. It was a Byzantine invention, cooked up sometime around the 7th century CE. And it didn't just burn, it stuck. Ships, walls, skin. It clung like syrup and kept burning, even on water. Historians still argue over its exact ingredients. Was it petroleum? Quicklime? A mix of sulfur and resin? No one really knows, because the Byzantines guarded the formula so fiercely that it vanished with their empire. You've got to hand it to them. If you're going to invent portable hellfire, maybe it's best not to leave the recipe lying around. Imagine you're an attacker, scaling a siege ladder, when suddenly, defenders lean over the parapets, aiming what looks like a giant metal tube. Before you can yell, "Wait, what's that?" a jet of flaming liquid blasts toward you, clinging to your armor, searing through your cloak, and igniting your comrades around you. Yeah, you probably won't survive that. Greek fire wasn't just a weapon, it was panic in liquid form. You pause by a weathered murder hole, those innocent-looking openings in the ceiling of a castle gatehouse. You peer up through it, imagining the moment attackers would surge beneath, only to be drenched in boiling oil, water, or, brace yourself, boiling sand. Wait, sand? Oh yes, sand might not sound scary until you realize it slips right through armor gaps, settling at your wrists, neck, and waist, where it cooks the flesh beneath. Unlike water, hot sand doesn't cool off quickly, and it clings, burrowing into places you can't reach, turning bold soldiers into flailing, shrieking messes in seconds. The oil, meanwhile, stuck to clothing and continued burning long after it landed. There's even a curious fringe account that some defenders added bits of pine resin or animal fat to make the burning mixture harder to extinguish. Whether that's fact or medieval scare tactic is still up for debate. As you wander through the fortress, you notice a pile of rounded stones stacked neatly near a parapet. Simple, right? Well, these weren't here for decoration. Gravity was one of the defenders' staples, best friends. When siege towers or battering rams rolled forward, defenders would drop rocks, logs, or anything heavy enough to smash a machine or scatter tightly packed soldiers. And if they were feeling especially theatrical, sometimes they tossed down dead animals. Yep, disease-ridden carcasses launched or dropped to spread filth, terror, and sickness. Historians still argue whether this tactic was genuinely effective or mostly psychological. But either way, it wasn't exactly a warm medieval welcome. Oh, and those clever traps? Castles were riddled with them. Imagine charging through a breached gate only to find yourself on a narrow wooden bridge designed to collapse under weight, dropping attackers into spiked pits below. Defenders loved setting these little surprises, turning their strongholds into giant obstacle courses of pain. Some even dug hidden pits covered with thin branches and dirt, waiting for you to take one confident step, and then whoosh, you're on your way to a sharp, pointy meeting with gravity. You step over where one such pit likely once gaped, marveling at how defenders turned architecture into weapons. Narrow staircases twisted in clockwise spirals, forcing right-handed attackers to fight uphill with limited sword room, while defenders had free, sweeping swings from above. Even the walls themselves played a role, with inner courtyards designed as death traps, where attackers would get funneled into tight spaces perfect for an ambush. And of course, let's not forget the most time-honored defensive weapon of all: time itself. Defenders weren't always trying to win outright. They just needed to hold on. Every extra day the walls stood meant the attackers burned through more food, lost more men to disease, and risked the arrival of reinforcements. Siege warfare wasn't just about smashing. It was about starving, waiting, and draining your enemy's will to keep going. They found ways to make boiling water a nightmare. They turned sand into a weapon. They engineered staircases, bridges, and traps to squeeze every last advantage from their stone walls. Siege warfare wasn't just brute force. It was cleverness wrapped in stone, fire, and sand. You brush a hand against the rough wall, its surface pitted from centuries of weather and war. Castles weren't just homes for nobles. They were complex machines of defense, designed to make every step the enemy took a dangerous one. And while the attackers brought their towers, rams, and trebuchets, the defenders answered with boiling rage, literally. They turned the very air, the walls, and even the ground beneath their feet into weapons. Siege warfare wasn't just a battle of armies. It was a duel of ingenuity, endurance, and occasionally, a very well-timed bucket of burning sand. You linger in the shadow of the battered tower, listening to the imagined echoes of those frantic days. For every ram that swung, for every tower that rolled forward, the defenders responded not only with boiling oil or burning sand, but with a far more patient weapon, the weapon of time. Because in siege warfare, every wasted hour was a small victory for those trapped behind the walls. The attackers, on the other hand, couldn't afford patience. They needed to break the defenders quickly, not just with brute force, but by cracking their spirits, shattering their confidence, and convincing them that resistance was hopeless. That's where the real game began, the psychological war. The siege wasn't just a test of stone and steel, it was a battle of minds. You glance across the field, picturing the carefully staged theater that unfolded during these sieges. Ancient commanders weren't just warriors, they were showmen. They knew the power of spectacle. They wanted you, trapped behind your sturdy stone walls, to see the colossal siege engines dragging closer. They wanted you to hear the rhythmic beat of the battering ram, the groaning creak of the trebuchet, the clatter of the siege tower's wheels. These weren't just noises, they were messages. You are not safe. The Assyrians were some of the earliest masters of this siege theater. They didn't sneak their siege engines up to the walls under cover of darkness. No, they made sure the defenders saw them coming from miles away, parading their machines in grand processions across the desert. Flags snapping in the wind, soldiers marching in perfect formation. The message was clear. Look how many we are. Look what we've built just to destroy you. The Romans took this psychological game even further. They would build their siege camps right in view of the defenders, sometimes within bowshot of the walls. Imagine standing on your crumbling battlements, watching your enemy leisurely construct rams, catapults, and siege towers day after day, as if they had all the time in the world and total confidence in their victory. You can almost feel the weight pressing on your chest as you realize these people aren't going anywhere. And then came the payloads, because when the machines were finally ready, what they launched wasn't always just rocks. Sometimes it was something far more chilling. Imagine a boulder arcing through the sky and slamming into your city square. You rush over, expecting rubble, and instead find the severed head of your fallen general, still wearing his helmet, still staring blankly. That's not just an attack, that's a message. We can get to you. You are next. The Mongols elevated this particular brand of psychological warfare to terrifying heights. During the siege of Kaffa in 1346, the Mongols allegedly catapulted plague-infected corpses over the walls to spread disease and panic. Historians still argue whether this really helped trigger the spread of the Black Death into Europe. But whether the disease came from the siege or not, the story itself rattled defenders across continents. The mere thought of enemy trebuchets launching rotten, diseased bodies into your city was enough to shake even the bravest soldier. And then, sometimes, the siege engines didn't fire anything at all. Silence, ominous, deliberate silence, could be just as frightening. After hours of battering rams thudding against the gates, after watching trebuchets launch rock after rock, what happens when the machines suddenly stop? When the rams pull back, the towers go still, and the trebuchets rest in eerie quiet. Is it over? Are they gone? Or are they just preparing something worse? The waiting gnaws at you. The silence presses in. Your breath quickens. Your hands tremble. And you can't help but imagine the worst. You walk along the inner wall, picturing the commander's growing desperation, hearing the whispered prayers of the townsfolk, the arguments among the soldiers. Should they keep fighting? Should they surrender? Siege warfare was a game of patience, yes, but also of fear. The attackers knew that sometimes they didn't need to knock the walls down. They just had to convince the people behind them that the walls wouldn't be enough. At the Siege of Constantinople in 1453, this psychological war reached its crescendo. The city's defenders, battered by cannon fire, clung to their faith in the strength of their ancient walls. Walls that had withstood centuries of siege engines. But these walls had never faced the thunderous power of gunpowder cannons. As the Ottomans bombarded the city relentlessly, each crushing impact reminded the defenders that their precious defenses were no longer invincible. The sound of those cannons wasn't just physical, it was a drumbeat of inevitability. Historians still argue whether the fall of Constantinople was sealed by the cannon's brute force or by the creeping realization among the defenders that their golden age was over. Maybe it wasn't the stones that failed first. Maybe it was the hearts. But centuries before gunpowder, the psychological weapons were more personal, more gruesome. Severed heads, rotting animals, scrawled insults wrapped around rocks, all hurled by siege engines that had become less like machines and more like giant, creaking, groaning messengers of doom. The trebuchet wasn't just a tool, it was a billboard. You pause, leaning against the cool stone as you picture that giant trebuchet known as Warwolf, the one the English used at the siege of Stirling Castle. The machine was so enormous, so terrifying. That legend says the Scottish defenders surrendered before it was even fired. And King Edward? He supposedly refused to accept their surrender. Why? Because he wanted to test the machine anyway. He made them endure the full terror of Warwolf's might, just to prove a point. Was this story exaggerated? Historians still debate that. But whether Warwolf fired because of pride or strategy, the message was the same. You cannot escape this. You continue your slow walk, trailing your hand along the wall as the imaginary clang of distant siege engines fades into silence. The defenders knew that sometimes a battle was lost long before the final breach. Sometimes the will to resist crumbled under the weight of dread. The endless pounding of rams, the looming shadow of trebuchets, and the suffocating grip of siege towers inching ever closer. Siege warfare wasn't just about walls and weapons. You slip through the darkened streets of the besieged city now, your footsteps hushed as you imagine the weariness pressing in from all sides. It's not just the battering of stones or the crash of siege towers that gnaws at the defenders. It's the slow, suffocating squeeze of starvation. The siege engine may have been the star of the show, but behind the creaking timber and flying projectiles was the oldest, quietest weapon of all, the blockade. When you're trapped behind walls with nowhere to run, time itself becomes the deadliest enemy. Every loaf of bread, every splash of clean water, every last grain matters. And the attackers knew it. They'd seal off supply lines, Surround the city like a tightening noose and wait. Slowly, inevitably, the food would run out. Historians still argue whether this slow starvation was more effective than brute force assaults. But you can't ignore its raw power. You can build walls to stop a ram. You can brace your gates against a tower. But you can't build anything to stop hunger. During the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, food supplies dwindled so painfully that people began hoarding rotten scraps, gnawing on leather belts, and even, brace yourself, boiling grass just to create something resembling soup. And that's one of the milder accounts. Whispers from ancient writers speak of far darker moments of the absolute collapse of human decency when desperation overtakes all else. But let's steer gently past the worst of those tales tonight. No need to dwell too deeply when we're trying to fall asleep, right? You can picture yourself perched on a crumbling balcony, listening to the groan of empty stomachs echoing through the streets. The city's defenders, once proud and defiant, now find themselves bargaining over scraps, measuring life one mouthful at a time. And then there's the quiet villain creeping in alongside starvation: disease. When you cram thousands of people behind walls with limited sanitation, disease is as inevitable as the sunrise. Dysentery, typhoid, smallpox, they flourish in these cramped, desperate spaces. You can almost feel the feverish heat prickling at your skin as you imagine the filth-streaked streets, the overflowing waste pits, the black flies buzzing thick in the air. In fact, one of the most curious siege defenses was the opposite of sanitary. Some cities, faced with starvation and disease, deliberately flung their own waste over the walls onto the enemy camps, trying to spread sickness among the besiegers. Imagine the awkward silence when the general's grand siege strategy is thwarted by, well, a flying chamber pot. A crude tactic, but in siege warfare, anything goes. You can almost smell the stale air inside these walled cities, thick with desperation and decay. And here's where the siege becomes more than just a physical blockade. It turns into a psychological chokehold. Every day without food, every new sickness, every cough in the night chips away at hope. At the Siege of Candia in the 17th century, a siege that dragged on for an astonishing 21 years, both the attackers and the defenders fell victim to the same slow death. The besieging Ottomans lost tens of thousands to disease, and the Venetian defenders inside the walls weren't faring much better. Eventually, exhaustion beat ambition. Both sides had suffered so deeply that victory felt hollow. And here's a quirky little nugget. Sometimes the besiegers themselves had to deal with surprise food shortages. During the siege of Syracuse in 213 BCE, the Roman attackers were so plagued by dysentery, likely caused by bad water and poor hygiene in their camps, that they were forced to retreat. So much for looking invincible. Food wasn't just about survival. It was a bargaining chip, a tool, a weapon. Sometimes, all it took was a whisper, a rumor that the enemy would offer mercy if the city surrendered quickly. Other times, the people simply couldn't take another day of gnawing hunger. And remember, siege warfare wasn't just about brute survival. The social fabric of the city frayed, then tore. Historians still debate whether ancient cities truly collapsed from external assault or from the slow rot of their own unraveling society under siege. You can almost feel the creeping dread as the sun sets each day with no rescue in sight, no secret supply tunnel, no miracle. Just the growing certainty that your walls are now your prison. The food is gone, the people are sick, and the enemy's banners still wave outside. Yet there's something stubborn about people under siege. Even when all seems lost, even when the walls tremble and the streets reek of desperation, many refuse to surrender. Pride, honor, fear of retribution, these things can be stronger than hunger. Sometimes, though, surrender came with a strange kind of theater. During medieval sieges, it wasn't uncommon for the defenders to walk out wearing nothing but their undergarments, carrying bare swords, heads bowed, a humble signal of defeat and a desperate plea for mercy. A performance as much as a surrender. You wonder what that moment must feel like, stepping out into the sunlight after weeks or months in darkness, blinking as you face your enemy, wondering if you'll live or die. But not all sieges ended with mercy. Sometimes the gates fell, and what followed was, well, you can imagine the chaos that erupted. But let's not rush there just yet. There's something more fascinating lurking inside these drawn-out sieges, the strange, messy human stories that unfolded while both sides waited, starving, sick, desperate, and impossibly stubborn. The siege was a living thing, evolving day by day, not just a static battle frozen in time. It breathed, it shifted, it decayed, and all the while, both the attacker and the defender knew that time was either their ally or their doom. You trail your hand along the crumbling stone, stepping carefully through a once bustling street, now reduced to shadows and silence. The ghosts of the starving lingering just beyond your reach. You keep moving now, stepping over broken timbers and scorched stone, weaving through the maze of forgotten alleys as the siege drags toward its inevitable climax. Time, patience, and hunger have done their part, but sometimes it's not enough. Sometimes, even after months of blockades and starvation, the walls refuse to break, the defenders refuse to bend, and the attackers grow tired of waiting. That's when the storming begins. The air crackles with a new kind of tension as siege engines roll forward, towers creak into place, and ladders bristle along the walls like the spines of some giant, angry beast. You can almost hear the barked orders, the thud of boots, the clash of metal as the final assault begins. If waiting doesn't work, smashing usually will. Historians still argue whether storming a city was a last-ditch act of desperation or a carefully calculated finale. Sometimes, the generals truly wanted to give the defenders one last chance to surrender. But sometimes, the siege was always destined to end in fire and blood. You probably won't survive this part. Just saying. One of the most famous and brutal siege assaults was the sack of Constantinople in 1204. The Crusaders, who were supposed to be heading to the Holy Land, got a little sidetracked. Instead, they turned their siege towers against the walls of the greatest city in the Christian world. And when they finally broke through, well, they didn't exactly behave like polite house guests. They looted, earned, and tore through the city in a frenzy that historians still debate today. Was it greed? Revenge? A chaotic accident? No one's really sure. But the storming of a city was rarely neat, rarely controlled. You climb the splintered rungs of an imaginary siege ladder now. Each step a gamble. Ladders were quick but terrifying. Defenders would hurl rocks, dump boiling water, and swing swords at your head as you tried to scramble to the top. And if you did make it over the wall, congratulations, you're now face to face with an enemy who's been waiting for you with a really bad attitude. But siege towers? Oh, they were the grand showstoppers. Imagine a giant wooden skyscraper, bristling with soldiers, slowly creaking toward the walls. They were sometimes covered in wet hides to resist fire. Because let's be honest, the defenders love setting things on fire. Fire was practically their love language. Sometimes, the attackers would build drawbridges onto the towers, lowering them directly onto the walls. And in one of the more delightful twists, defenders would occasionally wheel out their own mobile towers to duel in the sky, like a bizarre medieval parking lot standoff, but with more sharp objects. In the Siege of Rhodes in 1480, the Knights Hospitaller constructed massive defensive towers that could be pushed along the walls to counter the Ottoman siege towers. Imagine two colossal wooden beasts lumbering toward each other, creaking and groaning as soldiers inside prepared for a sky-high brawl. I mean, who needs dragons when you've got that? But not all stormings were about brute force. Sometimes the attackers got crafty. During the siege of Plataea in 429 BCE, the Spartans built a massive wooden platform to bridge the defensive ditch. The Plataeans? Oh, they simply tunneled beneath it, set the whole thing on fire, and watched it collapse into a satisfying heap of flames and smoke. Turns out, even in ancient Greece, digging could save your life. And speaking of tunnels, remember those sappers from earlier? They didn't just sneak beneath walls. Sometimes they packed those tunnels with dry brush and set them ablaze, hoping the heat would crack the stone foundations. Of course, this was a bit of a gamble. Sometimes, the defenders dug counter tunnels, leading to strange, claustrophobic underground battles in the pitch black. You, clutching your short sword, crawling on your hands and knees, knowing the next turn might put you face to face with someone who really doesn't want you there. It's a nerve-wracking image, isn't it? Historians still debate whether tunneling was more successful than using siege engines. Some cities had walls so thick and cleverly designed that even the most determined sappers couldn't bring them down. The city of Carcassonne in France, for example, had double walls, a brutal surprise for anyone who thought one set of stones would be enough to keep them out. But when the walls finally fell, oh, that's when the true chaos exploded. Streets that had been silent for months suddenly erupted with the sound of clashing swords, screaming horses, and crumbling buildings. The attackers poured in like a flood, and the defenders, well, at that point, you either fought to the last breath or tried to melt into the shadows, hoping not to be noticed. Here's where things get complicated. Despite the Hollywood-style images of total destruction, not every storming ended in a mindless rampage. Sometimes, the attackers offered mercy if the defenders surrendered quickly. Other times, the victorious soldiers looted methodically, sparing important religious sites or wealthy merchants who could pay hefty ransoms. And sometimes, just sometimes, the storming was more about making a statement than about total annihilation. At the siege of Harlech Castle during the Wars of the Roses, the final assault was as much about breaking morale as it was about conquering the stone walls. The defenders, who had held out for 7 long years, had become legends of stubborn resistance. When the gates finally fell, the psychological weight of defeat hit harder than any sword. Oh, and remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from way back? Well, in some sieges, defenders would smear themselves with ash or mud to look even more terrifying during final charges. You can almost hear the attackers thinking, "Did we just storm a fortress full of swamp monsters?" But even after the walls are breached, the story isn't over. Sometimes, the defenders retreat to an inner keep or tower, dragging the fight out for days more. Sometimes, the attackers grow so exhausted that they can't finish what they started. The siege of Tyre in 332 BCE dragged on even after Alexander's troops stormed the walls, because the defenders simply pulled back to another layer of defenses. Talk about frustrating. The storming phase was messy, unpredictable, and rarely fair. It was a gamble for both sides. Attackers risked being trapped inside unfamiliar streets, cut off from reinforcements, or overwhelmed by hidden defenders who knew every stone and shadow. And you're still weaving your way through this broken city, imagining the charge, the terror, the courage, the blinding noise as walls crumble and centuries-old stones shatter beneath your feet. You duck beneath a fallen beam, breathing in the dusty, acrid air as if you were there. The siege wasn't a clean ending. It was a violent punctuation mark in a long, painful sentence. And sometimes, even after the storm had passed, the story of the city was far from over. You pause at a jagged opening in the wall, feeling the wind tug at your hair, wondering what happens when the storm fades, when the victors move on, and the survivors are left to pick through the rubble. You step through that jagged breach in the wall now, your boots crunching over broken stone, the weight of silence pressing against your shoulders. The siege is over. At least, the storming part is. But what happens after the walls fall? What's left when the dust settles and the banners of the victors flutter in the smoke-stained sky? Here's where things get even more complicated. You might think that the conquerors would simply roll in, claim their prize, and call it a day. But post-siege life? Oh, it's messy. Cities don't just spring back to life like flipping a switch. The people who survive, if they survive, have to pick up the pieces. Some cities rebuild, some vanish into ruin, and some become eerie husks, their names whispered like bad omens. Take Carthage, for example. You might remember the Third Punic War, when Rome finally got tired of Carthage's stubborn existence and launched the ultimate siege. After years of brutal fighting, the Romans breached the city and unleashed destruction so complete that for centuries, people believed the Romans had salted the earth to prevent anything from growing there again. Modern scholars argue whether that whole salting the earth thing actually happened. It might be a dramatic legend more than a historical fact. But the point stands. Carthage was wiped from the map, at least for a while. And here's your quirky tidbit. When the Romans finally refounded Carthage years later, they accidentally built it on top of ancient burial grounds. I mean, if you're going to resurrect a city, maybe don't build your new houses on the old cemeteries. Just a thought. Not every post-siege story was so final. Some cities bounced back surprisingly quickly. When the Vikings sacked Paris in 845, you'd think the place would have taken ages to recover. But nope. Within a few years, Paris was thriving again, as if the terrifying river raid had been just a particularly bad Tuesday. But wait, it's not all about rubble and rebuilding. Sometimes, the politics after a siege were even nastier than the battle itself. When a city fell, deals were struck, power shifted, and promises were broken. Rulers were installed, ransoms collected, and revenge quietly plotted in candlelit rooms. Take the Siege of Jerusalem in 1099 during the First Crusade. When the Crusaders stormed the city, the aftermath was, how should we put this, pretty grisly. Historians still argue whether the scale of the massacre was exaggerated by medieval chroniclers, but one thing's clear, the takeover was brutal. Yet within a surprisingly short time, the city was being rebuilt as a new Christian stronghold. Merchants moved in, churches rose, and life, stubborn as ever, started again. You can almost see it, can't you? Traders picking through the wreckage, setting up makeshift stalls where bodies once lay, children chasing each other through blackened streets, the laughter almost managing to scrub out the echoes of swords and screams. Almost. But sometimes, the conquerors didn't want to rebuild. They wanted to send a message. Mongol sieges, for example, were legendary not just for their efficiency, but for the sheer scale of destruction left behind. The siege of Nishapur in 1221 reportedly ended with mass slaughter. Though historians still debate whether the death tolls were exaggerated for shock value. Either way, the message was crystal clear. Resist, and your city might vanish. And here's a weird little footnote for you. After a particularly brutal Mongol siege, it was said that the heads of the fallen were sometimes stacked in neat pyramids outside the ruined walls. Functional? Not really. Terrifying? Oh, absolutely. Talk about leaving a Yelp review with 0 stars. But let's step into the quieter moments now. Imagine the survivors creeping out of hiding, blinking in the harsh daylight, their homes reduced to rubble. Some would flee, seeking new towns, new kingdoms, new beginnings. Others would stay, stubbornly sweeping the streets, rebuilding walls with trembling hands, trying to stitch their lives back together. In medieval Japan, after castle sieges, the defeated samurai sometimes committed seppuku, a ritual suicide that, while horrifying to modern eyes, was a way to preserve honor. The victors, in turn, might show surprising restraint, sparing the families of the fallen, and even employing former enemies in new roles. The politics of survival could be just as sharp as any blade. Historians still argue whether post-siege mercy was driven by strategy or genuine compassion. Was it smarter to preserve a skilled population for taxes and trade? Or did some victors actually feel pity for the people whose lives they'd just shattered? Probably a mix of both, depending on who was holding the sword that day. And sometimes, post-siege life led to unexpected cultural fusion. When Muslim forces recaptured Jerusalem from the Crusaders in 1187 under Saladin, the aftermath was strikingly merciful. Saladin offered safe passage to the defeated Christians who couldn't afford ransom, and rather than razing the city, he restored it as a key Muslim center. It's a soft contrast to the brutal sack that had happened less than a century earlier. Oh, and here's a little sidebar for you. In some cities, local folklore sprouted from the ashes. Tales of ghostly defenders, curses on the invaders, and phantom armies marching through the ruins at night became part of the cultural fabric. Like the legend of the Grey Lady, who's said to haunt the Tower of London after its many sieges and political dramas. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, it's hard to ignore the way human memory lingers in stone and shadow. You stroll now through the skeletal remains of a city that's starting to breathe again. New market stalls spring up where battering rams once rolled. Masons rebuild walls that will, someday, face new sieges. Children chase stray dogs past crumbling towers, and life, stubborn as ever, creeps back in. But the scars remain. Sometimes the victors rebuilt the city in their own image, erasing the past, brick by brick. Sometimes they left parts of the ruins standing, a jagged monument to remind everyone what happens when you resist. And sometimes the city itself became a layered cake of history, with each siege, each ruler, each rebuilding phase leaving traces like ancient fingerprints. You can still see it in places like Istanbul, where Roman, Byzantine, and Ottoman layers stack like sediment, each telling its own part of the story. You pause by a cracked stone pillar, the wind tugging gently at your sleeve. You wonder whether the people who rebuilt these cities could feel the weight of the past beneath their feet, or whether, like most of us, they simply kept moving forward, one stubborn step at a time. You leave behind the city's ruined gates now, brushing the dust from your hands as you walk toward the wide, open fields where armies once camped, where tents once fluttered, where generals plotted and soldiers grumbled over cold rations. You can almost hear the distant clatter of armor and the low hum of war drums still hanging in the air. But as you move, something else rises to meet you. The stories of the commanders, the siege engineers, the people who made these victories and defeats possible. Let's face it, behind every legendary siege was some mastermind, some war-hardened strategist who either outwitted the defenders or tragically underestimated them. And if you're picturing a brooding, cape-wearing villain stroking an evil beard, well, you're not entirely wrong. But sometimes they were just people who happened to be really, really good at breaking walls. One of the most famous siege architects? Mehmed II, the Ottoman Sultan who brought down Constantinople in 1453. You might remember him as the guy who dragged massive cannons across miles of rough terrain just to batter the Theodosian walls, which had stood for over 1,000 years. Those walls were supposed to be impenetrable, like the password 123 of medieval fortifications. But Mehmed wasn't having it. Here's the historical fact for you. He employed a Hungarian engineer named Orban to build a super cannon called the Basilica, a monster so huge it took 60 oxen to move it. This cannon could hurl stone balls weighing over half a ton. Imagine waking up to that pounding your city walls. And yeah, it did exactly what you think. It cracked open those ancient defenses and changed the map forever. But here's a fringe tidbit. The cannon, for all its terrifying power, was wildly unreliable. It sometimes took hours to reload, and it occasionally exploded. Historians still argue whether Mehmed's heavy artillery was truly decisive, or whether Constantinople would have eventually fallen to the Ottomans' relentless assault anyway. Was it the superweapon that shattered an empire, or just really loud background noise to an inevitable collapse? You can almost picture two scholars in a library somewhere, still debating it over their third cup of tea. And speaking of engineers, let's not forget the legendary Archimedes of Syracuse. Yep, the math guy, the one who figured out buoyancy while taking a bath. Turns out he was also a master of building siege defenses. When the Romans came knocking in 213 BCE, Archimedes turned the city into a fortress of mind-bending traps and defensive machines. He reportedly designed catapults with adjustable ranges, cranes that could tip Roman ships over, and, this is my personal favorite, mirrors that supposedly focused sunlight to set enemy ships on fire. Now, historians still argue whether the whole death ray mirror thing was just ancient hype, or whether Archimedes really did weaponize sunshine like a Mediterranean supervillain. Modern experiments have tried to replicate it with mixed results. But hey, whether it worked or not, it's the kind of legend you hope is true. Of course, not every siege hero was on the attacking side. Some were legendary defenders. Remember the Siege of Malta in 1565? The tiny island held out against an overwhelming Ottoman fleet, thanks in large part to Jean de Valette, the Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller. De Valette was a master of using the geography, rallying his ragged defenders, and personally leading charges across the walls. Fun fact, de Valette's leadership during that siege was so iconic that when the capital city was rebuilt afterward, they named it Valletta in his honor. Kind of like getting the ultimate street named after you, but, you know, an entire city. Meanwhile, fringe history lovers might appreciate this odd nugget. The defenders of Malta, short on cannonballs at one point, reportedly fired chains, rocks, and even pieces of marble columns from old buildings. Waste not, want not, right? Pretty sure someone in the back yelled, "Just throw the furniture next." It was desperate, but it worked. But siege masterminds weren't always grizzled war veterans. Sometimes, They were underestimated thinkers who reshaped warfare. Take Alexander the Great and his famous siege of Tyre in 332 BCE. The island city of Tyre was supposed to be unbreachable. It sat half a mile off the coast, with thick walls rising straight from the sea. So what did Alexander do? He built a causeway. That's right, he turned the sea into a highway. It took months, back-breaking labor, and an unhealthy amount of patience. But eventually, Alexander's forces rolled their siege towers right up to Tyre's walls. The city fell. And here's the kicker. The causeway is still there today. Thousands of years later, it changed the local geography forever. That's a kind of victory you can literally see on Google Maps. Historians still argue whether Alexander's siege was a moment of pure genius, or whether he just got incredibly lucky with favorable tides and a stubborn workforce. You get the sense that even Alexander was surprised when it worked. And sometimes, the most brilliant siege masters weren't in charge of armies. They were the unsung engineers who designed the siege engines, the wall-destroying behemoths that looked like something straight out of a steampunk fever dream. Battering rams, siege towers, trebuchets, each had their moment in the spotlight. The trebuchet in particular was the medieval rock star of siege warfare. With its counterweight design, it could hurl projectiles with terrifying precision and force. Some of these monsters could launch 300-pound stones over 1,000 feet. Oh, and the quirky bit? In some sieges, trebuchets were reportedly used to fling disease-ridden animal carcasses over the walls, a medieval form of biological warfare. Enjoy your complimentary plague delivery. Not exactly the welcome gift you want arriving in your courtyard. But even as siege machines got bigger and deadlier, defenders adapted. They built angled walls to deflect cannonballs, constructed star forts with bastions designed to trap invading forces in deadly crossfire zones. It became a high-stakes chess game of attack and defense, innovation and counter-innovation. And you know what? Historians still argue about when exactly siege warfare became obsolete. Was it when gunpowder artillery became powerful enough to reduce walls in a matter of hours? Or was it when armies shifted to fast-moving campaigns that left slow sieges in the dust? Either way, by the time tanks rolled onto battlefields centuries later, the glory days of the trebuchet were long gone. You walk now along the imagined lines of those ancient battlefields, the blueprints of siege engines sketched in the dirt at your feet, the whispered calculations of long-forgotten engineers floating on the wind. You can almost hear them, still arguing about the best angle, the perfect weight, the flawless trajectory. Because even though the walls may have fallen, the minds that broke them, they left their mark. You wander now from the echoes of battlefield brilliance towards something quieter, but no less intense. The long, grueling aftermath of a siege. You've marched through the storm of boulders, heard the crack of cannon fire, and now you step over the rubble into what's left behind. Broken streets, smoldering doorways, and people trying to rebuild their lives from whatever fragments they can gather. See, the siege might be over when the walls fall, but for the people inside, that's when the real fight begins. Let's start with a harsh truth. Surviving a siege didn't always mean you got to live happily ever after. Sometimes, the victors were merciful. Sometimes, not so much. Picture the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, a brutal Roman siege led by Titus that left the city in ruin. Historical fact: after months of starvation and relentless assault, the Romans finally broke through. The temple was destroyed, thousands were killed, and the survivors, many were sold into slavery or forced to flee. The siege ended, but the trauma stuck around like a bad cough. Jerusalem was never quite the same again. In fact, historians still argue whether the Roman destruction was a deliberate attempt to erase Jewish cultural identity, or simply the grim conclusion of a chaotic rebellion. Either way, the scars lingered, carved deep into both stone and memory. But not all post-siege stories were steeped in tragedy. Sometimes, cities rose back with a kind of stubborn pride. Take Vienna, after the famous siege of 1683. Remember that one? Ottoman forces tried to take the city, but Christian armies rallied to its defense. When the siege broke, the city didn't just rebuild, it flourished. Vienna transformed into a cultural powerhouse in the centuries that followed, as if it wanted to shout to the world, "Yeah, we survived, and we make great coffee now." Oh yes, speaking of coffee, here's a quirky tidbit. Legend says that when the Ottomans fled Vienna, they left behind sacks of coffee beans. Locals, unsure what they were, almost burned them as useless spoils. But then, some brave soul brewed a cup, and allegedly, that's how Vienna's iconic coffee culture began. Now, historians still argue whether this caffeine origin story is just a frothy myth or grounded in some nugget of truth. Either way, next time you sip a Viennese blend, you're basically drinking siege history. But not everyone could sip and smile after the walls came down. Many times, sieges left communities in utter collapse. Food supplies were decimated, disease often followed closely behind, and trade networks could take years or even generations to recover. Picture the besieged city of Harlech Castle in Wales during the Wars of the Roses. It endured a 7-year siege, the longest in British history. 7 years. You can't even commit to a gym membership for that long. By the end, the people were starving, desperate, and surrounded by crumbling walls. When the siege finally broke, the survivors didn't throw a party. They were just glad to walk outside again. And sometimes sieges didn't end with a clear winner. Like the siege of Candia, modern Heraklion, on the island of Crete, which dragged on for an eye-watering 21 years. Yes, you heard that right. 21 years of siege. People literally grew up and had children during the siege. At that point, the soldiers probably just sighed, "You know what? This is my life now." Historians still argue whether this siege was prolonged by brilliant Venetian resistance, Ottoman mismanagement, or just sheer bad luck on both sides. And here's the quirky detail. The siege was so long that entire new siege walls were built over time, like a living layer cake of fortifications. But here's the thing you keep noticing. Even after the last arrow is fired, the last rock is hurled, life stubbornly pushes forward. Cities don't just vanish after sieges. They adapt. Some grow new districts. Some rewrite their maps. Others become quiet ruins, their crumbled stones whispering to the weeds and the wind. Take the ancient city of Troy. You've probably heard of that wooden horse. Whether the whole thing happened exactly as Homer described is still up for debate. Historians still argue whether Troy's fall was a literal event, a symbolic story, or a bit of both. But even after the supposed fall, people continued to live there. The layers of the city stack like a historical parfait, each rebuilding on top of the last, century after century. The archaeological site of Troy actually has 9 layers of settlements. 9. That's like history's version of try again, but harder. And here's something you might not have considered. Siege survivors sometimes became refugees, carrying their traditions, their skills, and their stories to new places. Whole neighborhoods in faraway cities were shaped by these displaced communities. The fall of Constantinople, for example, scattered Byzantine scholars across Europe. many of whom carried ancient Greek texts that would later help spark the Renaissance. You know, no big deal. Just accidentally jump-starting one of history's greatest cultural revivals. Sometimes, the most valuable thing taken from a siege wasn't gold or territory, it was knowledge. Blueprints, architectural styles, siege technologies, all moved across borders along with the people who survived. You can almost see it, can't you? A defeated engineer grudgingly teaching his conqueror how to build a better fortress next time. And even in cities that didn't fully recover, memory held on tight. In Carthage, after the Romans famously salted the earth following the Third Punic War, though tiny spoiler, historians still argue whether the Romans actually salted the fields or whether that's just dramatic storytelling. The site eventually came back to life. Roman Carthage rose from the ashes as a new colony. Life, as always, finds a way. The aftermath of a siege is often painted as quiet, but in truth, it's buzzing with slow, persistent energy. Rebuilding streets, clearing debris, piecing together fractured governments, repairing the homes you once defended with pots and pans. And sometimes, the legacy of a siege lives on in songs and stories. Remember the Scottish stronghold of Stirling Castle? Its repeated sieges during the Wars of Scottish Independence became woven into national identity. Braveheart vibes, anyone? The echoes of those battles became more than just history. They became the backbone of cultural pride. The quirky tidbit here: the castle's Great Hall was painted bright yellow in its prime, possibly to signal wealth and strength. It's been restored to that banana-hued glory today. And honestly, if you're going to make a comeback after being besieged multiple times, why not do it in bold, unmissable color? You keep walking now, past makeshift markets springing up in ruined plazas, past the slow stitching of society's fabric, the quiet sound of stones being laid atop stones. The siege is over, but its breath lingers. And maybe that's the real story, how people keep going. Your steps now carry you toward the minds behind the sieges, the architects of these prolonged battles, the rulers and generals who ordered the catapults to be built, the trenches to be dug, and the walls to be battered until they crumbled like stale bread. You've seen what sieges did to the cities, but now you wonder, who sat in smoky war tents poring over maps, deciding that yes, this siege must happen? Let's pull back the curtain on these masterminds, both the famous and the forgotten, because trust me, behind every siege is a web of ambition, revenge, and sometimes the most comically human mistakes. Let's start with Alexander the Great. You remember him from earlier, the guy who turned the Siege of Tyre into a beachfront construction project. His name is practically tattooed on the history of siege warfare. He wasn't just about fast cavalry and epic charges. No, Alexander had patience when he needed it. Historical fact, they ended up besieging one of the greatest Christian cities instead. Classic wrong turn energy. Historical fact, in 1204, these pilgrims stormed Constantinople and looted it, toppling one of the mightiest cities in the world. The quirky tidbit? They stole so much stuff that to this day, you can see ancient relics from Constantinople sitting in places like St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. And yes, historians still argue whether the whole misadventure was a tragic accident or a pre-planned Venetian conspiracy for power and profit. Sometimes, the architects of sieges weren't kings or emperors, but engineers, the quiet problem solvers tucked away behind the scenes. Like during the Siege of Alesia, where Julius Caesar trapped the Gallic leader Vercingetorix. Caesar didn't just build one wall around the city. Oh no, that would have been too basic. He built two. One wall to keep the defenders in, and another wall facing outward to keep enemy reinforcements out. A double-walled mega-trap. Very two can play at this game energy. Historians still argue whether Caesar's siege was his most brilliant military feat or simply a stroke of good fortune mixed with Gaulish bad luck. But what's undeniable is the sheer mind game involved. Imagine sitting inside those walls, realizing you're boxed in from both sides. You can't help but wonder if Vercingetorix just stared at the horizon and sighed, "Really? A second wall?" Let's slide over to medieval Japan for a moment, where siege leaders sometimes took a different flavor. Less about smashing walls, more about psychological warfare. During the siege of Odawara in 1590, Toyotomi Hideyoshi led his massive army against the Hojo clan's stronghold. But instead of rushing in with swords blazing, he surrounded the castle with festivities, dances, parties, even a portable tea house. The quirky twist? Hideyoshi basically threw a blockade and a festival at the same time, as if to say, "We can wait as long as you like, but we're going to have fun while doing it." The defenders, seeing their enemies enjoying themselves for weeks while they starved, eventually surrendered. Historians still argue whether Hideyoshi's relaxed siege broke the Hojo's spirit, or whether the clan had simply run out of options. And then, sometimes the siege architects were guided by sheer desperation. During the Siege of Paris in 1870, the French forces, hopelessly surrounded by the Prussians, resorted to some rather unconventional meals. Historical fact: Parisians ended up eating rats, zoo animals, and reportedly even elephants from the city's botanical gardens. The quirky tidbit? Local butchers proudly advertised elephant steak as a delicacy. Bon appetit? Historians still argue whether the city's dietary flexibility actually extended the siege's resistance or was just a grim curiosity of survival. But whether they were emperors or engineers, festival throwers or elephant connoisseurs, siege architects often faced impossible choices. Starve the city, and you risk dragging the siege out for years. Storm the walls, and your own soldiers could face catastrophic losses. Build siege engines, and you might just run out of wood before you even get close. You can almost hear these leaders pacing in their tents, balancing maps and morale, victory and resources. The weight of those decisions was colossal. And yet, sometimes the smallest mistakes tipped the scales. Like during the Siege of Antioch in the First Crusade. The Crusaders were exhausted, their supplies were nearly gone, and their siege engines had failed. It should have been the end for them. But then, a local Christian sympathizer secretly let them in through a less guarded tower. Sometimes all it took was one unlocked door. Historians still argue whether the Crusaders would have succeeded without that inside help, or whether Antioch would have crushed them in the following weeks. It's one of those delicious history what-ifs that leaves you turning it over in your mind as you walk. Even the Mongols, masters of mobile warfare, proved to be frighteningly efficient siege architects. Remember Kublai Khan? When he wanted to conquer the fortified Chinese city of Xiangyang, he didn't rely on steppe cavalry alone. He imported Muslim engineers who built enormous counterweight trebuchets capable of hurling massive stones farther than anything the defenders had seen. Historical fact: within days of these terrifying machines arriving, the city walls crumbled. The quirky tidbit here? Some sources claim the first stones launched by these trebuchets caused the Chinese defenders to panic and flee their posts in disbelief. You can imagine the stunned silence as those first boulders soared overhead, like angry moons. Historians still argue whether Kublai's success hinged on these foreign engineers or whether his victory was inevitable given his relentless strategy. Either way, it's a reminder. Sometimes the smartest siege architects knew when to borrow a little brilliance from someone else. And you, walking now through the dusty halls of strategy, realize that these architects, kings, engineers, and sometimes just lucky opportunists shaped the siege not just with weapons, but with patience, creativity, and occasionally a well-timed feast. Your feet carry you now toward the shadows of the sieges, the parts no one really wants to think about, but the parts that made these battles what they truly were. Siege warfare wasn't just walls and weapons. It was disease, desperation, betrayal, and the slow crumbling of the human spirit. You've seen the mighty towers and the clever siege machines, but now you're about to wander through the quieter, more uncomfortable corridors of the story. Let's start with disease, because honestly, if there was a most likely to kill you in a siege award, it would go to sickness every single time. Historical fact, in most sieges, disease killed far more people than swords or arrows ever could. Filthy water, rotting food, cramped living spaces. It's the perfect recipe for outbreaks. During the siege of Leningrad in World War II, typhus, dysentery, and starvation ran rampant. The quirky tidbit? People reportedly started boiling wallpaper for soup because wallpaper paste contained traces of flour. Yeah, you've hit rock bottom when you're seasoning your soup with old glue. Historians still argue whether the Soviet government could have evacuated more civilians from Leningrad in time, or if the brutal winter sealed everyone's fate from the beginning. Either way, the city became a heartbreaking symbol of survival on the edge. But even long before modern warfare, disease quietly lurked behind the walls. During medieval sieges, armies often tried to speed up this invisible enemy's work by launching diseased bodies over city walls. Remember the siege of Kaffa in 1346? It's widely believed the Mongols catapulted plague-infected corpses into the city, potentially helping to kickstart the Black Death's deadly march into Europe. Historians still argue whether this was the true spark of the plague's spread or simply one of many ugly accelerants. But the image of disease being weaponized like that, it sticks with you. Then there's starvation. Sure, we've touched on the elephant steaks in Paris, but the depths of siege starvation go even further. In the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, the Roman forces led by Titus blockaded the city for months. Supplies dwindled and famine clawed its way into every home. Josephus, the historian who recorded it, tells of people eating leather belts and shoe soles just to keep going. The quirky tidbit? There are reports of people hoarding food while pretending to starve, creating this grim theater of suffering while hiding precious scraps. Historians still argue whether Josephus exaggerated these stories for dramatic flair or whether the desperation really drove people to such extremes. But sometimes, starvation wasn't just a side effect. It was the entire plan. You remember Hideyoshi's Tea Party siege? Well, other commanders weren't quite as patient. During the siege of Kenilworth Castle in 1266, one of the longest sieges in English history, the attackers starved out the defenders over 6 long months. Historical fact: when the garrison finally surrendered, they were so weak that they had to crawl out of the gates. The quirky twist? Despite all that suffering, historical fact: during the siege of Babylon in 539 BCE, the Persian king Cyrus the Great allegedly took the city by diverting the Euphrates River, lowering the water levels so his soldiers could sneak in through the riverbed. but quirky sources suggest that Babylonian sympathizers may have also quietly swung open key gates, making the conquest far less dramatic than the river story suggests. Historians still argue whether Cyrus's brilliant river maneuver was the primary reason for his success, or whether it was good, old-fashioned betrayal that made the difference. And this isn't some ancient footnote. Betrayals happened in siege after siege, like hidden cracks in fortress walls. You can almost hear the whispered promises in dark corners: gold, freedom, safety for family. In the end, loyalty often proved fragile when hunger gnawed at the ribs and the enemy's offer glittered just a little too brightly. But not all betrayal was treason. Sometimes, people were simply too exhausted to keep fighting. Picture the siege of La Rochelle in the 1620s. The French crown blockaded the Huguenot city by land and sea, starving it into submission. As supplies ran out, people had to make impossible choices. Who eats? Who waits? Who quietly slips away through secret passages? The quirky tidbit? The blockade was so tight that the city's defenders built bizarre floating devices, essentially human-sized barrels, to try and smuggle messages and supplies past enemy ships. Imagine bobbing helplessly in one of those, hoping the waves don't sell you out. Historians still argue whether the defenders could have broken the siege with better coordination, or whether surrender was inevitable once the crown's patience outlasted the city's spirit. As you keep walking, you notice another silent siege weapon: time. Sieges weren't fast. They stretched on for months, sometimes years. And that slow grind wore people down far more than a single bloody battle could. Imagine waking up every day to the same walls, the same tension, the same rumbling stomach. The enemy campfires glowing on the horizon like tiny, unmoving stars. The same songs of desperation sung over and over until they lose all meaning. That's the cruel beauty of a siege. The battle is often won not with swords, but with silence, waiting for your opponent to break themselves. But let's not forget, sometimes, despite all the odds, people held out. The siege of Candia on the island of Crete dragged on for an unbelievable 21 years. Yes, you heard that right. 21 years. Historical fact, it's the longest siege in recorded history. You probably would have grown a full beard just waiting for the battering rams to show up. The quirky detail? Over 2 decades, both sides swapped soldiers, shifted leadership, and even paused for occasional peace talks. But the Ottomans just wouldn't let it go. Historians still argue whether the siege was driven by genuine strategy or by stubborn pride that no one wanted to back down from. And as you finally emerge from these dark corners of desperation, you realize that siege warfare wasn't just about walls or weapons. It was about willpower, about how long you could last, how much you could endure, how close you could edge toward the breaking point before someone finally snapped. Your footsteps now echo softly, the weight of disease, starvation, betrayal, and slow creeping time trailing behind you like ancient dust. And still, there's more to see, more to feel. You step forward, and now you're brushing past the grand finale of siege warfare. Not the flashy battering rams or the catapults hurling stones, but the final act. What happens when the walls come tumbling down? You've seen the long wait, the diseases, the betrayals, but now comes the breach. The terrible, beautiful, unstoppable moment when defenders crumble, gates shatter, and chaos pours in. It's not always how you'd picture it in the movies. Sometimes the walls don't dramatically collapse in a puff of dust and glory. Sometimes it's a quiet failure, a small crack, a forgotten gate, a starving soldier asleep at his post. Take the siege of Constantinople in 1453. You can almost hear the desperate clang of swords, the thunder of cannon fire, the terrified heartbeat of a city about to fall. The massive Ottoman bombardments, the legendary walls, the wild scramble to patch breaches with whatever the defenders can find. It all comes to a shuddering climax. Historical fact: Constantinople's Theodosian walls had protected the city for over 1,000 years, but the Ottomans' cannons, especially the monstrous one designed by Orban, finally smashed through them. And here's the quirky detail you'll love. Legend has it that on the morning of the final assault, a tiny, rarely used gate called the Kirkeporta was left open, accidentally. Some say it was a panicked mistake. Others whisper it was sabotage. Through that small opening, the Ottomans surged in. Historians still argue whether the gate was truly left open, or whether this was a dramatic flourish added later to give the city's fall a tragically simple twist. Imagine standing there as the walls, the defenders, so tired, so stretched, still fighting, still believing in the impossible. And then, the flood. Soldiers pour in. Streets fill with battle cries and smoke. You probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes in that chaos. But if you did, you'd see that the fall isn't clean or swift. It's messy, personal, human, and not all falls are the same. Some defenders, knowing they're done for, choose to surrender with dignity, hoping for mercy. Some go out swinging, like the defenders of Masada, where Jewish rebels famously held out against the Roman Empire. When the Romans finally breached the fortress, they found silence. Historical fact: according to the account of Josephus, the defenders had committed mass suicide rather than fall into Roman hands. Historians still argue whether this mass suicide actually happened as described, or whether it was Josephus adding a dramatic ending to elevate the story. The quirky detail? The archaeologists who explored Masada in modern times found date seeds that were over 2,000 years old. Scientists actually managed to sprout one of them in the early 2000s, growing a tree nicknamed Methuselah, a quiet, living echo of that ancient siege. Other falls ended with moments of surprising mercy. The quirky tidbit: Carcassone's restoration was so detailed that some people thought it looked too perfect, as if someone had tried to Photoshop history. Historians still argue whether the restoration preserved the city's authenticity or erased the raw, battle-worn edges that gave it soul. But other cities simply dissolve. Babylon, the once mighty jewel of Mesopotamia, fell to Cyrus and never truly recovered its former glory. Today, you can walk through its ruins, just scattered bricks, cracked walls, a whisper of the past. And sometimes, you can almost hear the echoes of the siege that broke it. You start to feel the weight of all these stories now. The quiet truth that siege warfare wasn't always about decisive battles. Sometimes the winners crawled across the finish line, exhausted and broken. Sometimes the losers walked away freer than the victors. And sometimes, centuries later, historians still flip dusty pages, trying to decide who really won and who simply survived. And then you stumble across one final image, a thread that loops the whole journey together. It's not the grand walls or the clanging catapults. It's the people. The frightened child clutching a wooden doll as cannon fire roars. The soldier gnawing on leather in a cold corner. The mother whispering lullabies while the walls shake. The cook stirring one last pot of whatever scraps remain. Sieges are stories about walls, yes, but more than that, They're stories about waiting, about testing the edges of endurance, about how far people can be pushed before they break, or before they fight back harder than anyone expected. And you, wandering through this ancient battlefield of patience and hunger, you felt it all. The grinding boredom, the thrilling inventions, the soft betrayal, the gnawing sickness, the final desperate sprints for survival. You've walked the long, slow path from the outside of the walls to their shattered hearts. Your footsteps soften as you drift away from the battlefield now. The sharp edges of stone walls blur. The clang of distant weapons fades to a hush. All around you, the echoes of catapults and marching boots grow quieter, as if history itself is finally ready to rest. The sieges you've traveled through, each one layered with desperation, invention, betrayal, and stubborn hope, begin to settle into the background, like old paintings hanging on quiet museum walls. No more alarms, no more feverish building of siege towers, no more counting the rations or searching for cracks in the enemy's defenses. Just soft air, long shadows, and the gentle crumble of ancient fortresses. You start to notice the little things now. The warm stone beneath your hands, the faint rustle of trees growing where armies once camped, the sleepy hum of the wind slipping through empty arrow slits.